So good morning, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to our webinar this morning, which is on capturing value, how we can measure the success of social sciences commercialisation. And I'm delighted you can join us this morning. I'm Julia Black. I'm professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and I'm chair of the Aspect Network, which is a consortium of universities who are working together to maximise the impact of social science through collaboration with business and through commercialisation. We have an excellent panel with us this morning, I'm delighted to say. So Ian Diamond is head of the Office of National Statistics. We have Professor Susanna Morato, who's Professor of Geography and Environment at the LSE. Stephen Chambers, who's Director of the Marshall Institute, also at LSE. And Professor Nick Beach, who's Vice Chancellor of Middlesex University and President of the Academy of Management. So the issue of social value and how we measure social value is increasingly important. We are seeing huge efforts which we will be needing to make to, as has been said, rebuild back better after COVID in different ways. We know that we have to rebuild our economy, but we also know that other things really matter in society. And we've seen how our key workers, for example, have been at the forefront of what it is that we've had to be doing in terms of fighting the pandemic. So we know that in terms of how we need to reshape perhaps our economies, but also our societies, that we need to think quite hard and much more carefully about how we assess social value, as well as economic value, and of course, natural value and the value of the environment. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to offer their thoughts on that question for about 5 or 6 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up for questions. And you can pose questions through the Q&A, and we will try and get through as many of those as we can during our session this morning. So in order to waste no further time, I'm going to ask Ian if he can kick us off today, please. Ian.
Julia, thank you very much. And colleagues, it's an enormous privilege to be able to say a few words. And what I'm going to do is draw on the sorts of things that I have been doing over the last some decades. And I hope that they will have some relevance to you. Let me start. For those of you who think that there is, if you like, a linear model here, there isn't. What I mean by that is we have this kind of picture of a light bulb coming on in a researcher's mind, and then somehow a couple of years down the road, there is, if you like, some social value, or there's a widget on a shelf to buy. It just might work in some areas of physics, I don't know. It certainly, in my experience, doesn't work across the social sciences at all. Rather, research in the social sciences is, by its very nature, not a kind of light bulb the great majority of the time. It is an accumulation of evidence. And that accumulation of evidence links through to the person who's doing the work, and they bring the wealth of experience. So one of the most celebrated examples is the way in which anthropologists with decades of experience in West Africa were able to highlight some of, for example, the practices in those areas which would impact on the transmission of Ebola. And so anthropology was able to bring real social value by acting alongside the medical professionals to minimize the risk of transmission. And I see that very much now as we respond to the pandemic. There is some brilliant and absolutely wonderful biomedical science, but alongside it is the behavioral science. And the behavioral science is not coming straight from a piece of research where someone has done, oh, this is what happens if we do this. It is the accumulative knowledge of people like Teresa Marteau, who have decades of experience in behavioral science, who can bring that to the table. So first point, things are cumulative. Second point, transforming research into social value is really simple. And I've already hinted that it's typically and very often multidisciplinary, but it's really, really simple. if you, for example, I think one of the major issues we face as a nation at the moment is how do we impact on obesity? And actually, to impact on obesity, I once saw a big diagram of what would have to happen for policy. And that required 9 different government departments to act in tandem across a very big picture. So policy is often challenging and is multidisciplinary and is really simple. But I would say very clearly, please, 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 please don't boil the ocean. Don't try to boil the ocean. Pick it down and let's address particular issues and how that can impact, and basically work towards the accumulation of small gains. I would argue is the best way forward. So cumulative, really simple, often multidisciplinary. And how do you do it? One of the worst things, in my view, is when I talk to people who say, I've got a great idea to gain social value, and I've worked on it in my office, and then I'll throw it over a metaphorical wall and hope someone will catch it. In my experience, the very, very best social value comes when the potential beneficiaries are involved on day 0 and the work is co-created. Throughout my career, I've seen very many examples of where the very best times we've actually added social value has come when from day 0 we co-created the work, and that had a really positive impact on the way that not only the results but the way the work was undertaken. I'll give you an example. In 2014, I was privileged to be asked to have a look at the funding system for higher education in Wales. And I must admit, I went in with some ideas, but actually the solution, and it's gone down extremely well, came from really working cheek by jowl with the student body in Wales and listening to them the whole time about what were the key issues, for them. And then we built a higher education funding system which worked to maximize the benefit that students got from their period at university, and that seemed to me what we were trying to achieve. So mostly cumulative, really simple, often multidisciplinary. Please, please, please co-create. And the final point is it's a two-way street. Don't think that as researchers you can simply impact on social value, or if you are receiving social value, please don't think you can simply say to researchers, what is your latest piece of work? It needs a real interaction, and it needs, amongst those people who are going to benefit from the social value, a commitment to that, and for those people who are developing that research, a commitment there too. So it's a two-way street. Julia, a few points. I hope that was helpful. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Ian. And I think you're absolutely right to emphasize that process of engagement and creating impact with social science research has to be through that co-collaboration. You also picked on a couple of really interesting areas where social value is being created through health and through education, for example. And one of the things we're looking at is often, well, how do you measure that success? How do you measure that success? So Susanna, I'm going to turn to you now, if I may, because this is one of the areas that you're working in, you specialize in. So talk to us about how we assess social value and how important it is to do so.
Thank you, Julia. I'm going to share my screen. I just have a few slides. So I'm going to be talking about the social value of social science research. It's a bit of a mouthful. Obviously, if we want to commercialize social science research, we need to understand its value. We need to understand who the beneficiaries are. So this is an important thing to do. And I'll start by defining what is social value, because often people mean different things. So social value from an economic perspective is the net positive effect that an organization, a program, or an intervention, in this case research, has for society. So it's about the net benefit to society of research. And by net benefit, I mean increases in people's well-being and quality of life. So what we're looking at as social value are changes in well-being from this research. And because we're talking about well-being and so many things affect well-being, this is a very comprehensive approach. So we look at impacts on employment, education, health, environment, crime, sports, culture, community cohesion, social capital, and so on. It's an overall assessment of the impacts on well-being through all those channels. And how do we go about measuring it? So I spent my career measuring social value. Well, there is actually in the UK best practice guidance on how to do it on social value measurement, and it can be found on the Treasury Green Book, latest edition in 2018. And basically it follows simple cost benefit principles. We know we need to find out what the costs of producing the research is, and then we compare it with the benefits. And it's in the estimation of the benefits that's the complication, as Ian mentioned. There's multiple impacts of many disciplines, many actors. So it's really difficult to estimate the benefit side of the research. Now, we need to have everything in the same unit if we want to get this assessment. And typically we use monetary measures to compare the costs and benefits, but it doesn't have to be in monetary terms. There's a whole body of research that looks at social value in terms of well-being, in terms of happiness. So there are alternatives, but the standard way of doing this is to try and monetize these impacts, because that's the way decisions are done. And it's easier to explain what value is if we are able to monetize these benefits. Some of them are easy to monetize because increases in productivity, they're expressed in monetary terms, but many impacts on the environment, on social capital, they're so-called intangibles. They're not traded in markets, they don't have prices. It is very difficult to monetize this, but there's been decades of research on how to do it. So there's a wide range of methodologies that can be used to attempt to uncover the value of these impacts. And the Green Book also highlights what the methods, the sort of the best methods that we have at the moment to do this are. So it's a good reference point for people interested in this area. And I'll just, after Ian said that things weren't linear, but I'm going to just try to explain a very simple example of what we require for so we have research, we want to find the social value of research, but there's an intermediate step that's extremely important, is to establish the impact of the research on the impact on the indicators that we're interested in. And I'm going to give a very simple example. Of course, there is also a whole body of research on how to do impact, and this has developed over recent years. There's been Nobel Prize winners in this area, established the causal impact of interventions. It's been applied to many areas, projects, regulations, etc. But it could also be attempted to research. I've seen some people attempt to establish the causal impact of research in particular areas, but it's very difficult to do because, as Ian mentioned, there's multiple pathways to impact, many channels, many actors, many disciplines. But if I could cite a very simple example, and again, it's on behavioral science. Suppose someone writes a book on behavioral science that explains nudges and framing effects, and the CEO of a supermarket reads that book, gets inspired, and tries to use it to minimize use of plastic bags in its supermarkets. So the impact, a metric of impact would be number of plastic bags used. And then indirect impacts could be, marine life is saved because there's less plastic bags, there's less litter because there's less plastic bags, and those are metrics of impact. In this case, an environmental example. But then what we want to know is, okay, so but how does that affect well-being? How am I affected because of these particular impacts? And so we need to try and monetize that and find out how much people are willing to pay for species conservation, for less littering, and so on, and therefore uncover the monetary value of these particular impacts. Now, this is one impact, but of course, thousands of people might have read that book, thousands of people might have changed their behavior. And so you just from one simple example, you could see that's almost impossible to capture all the direct, indirect, induced and spillover effects of one particular piece of research. But when we're looking at the impact of research, we shouldn't just look at what researchers sometimes described as impact is the number of citations, the number of publications, how many seminars you go to. That's not what we mean by impact here. We mean outward facing impact, impact on society, impact on well-being. So, as I said, there are in terms of the social values, some are market values, they're private benefits, private actors benefit from this research. Those can be commercialized. The problem is the much broader intangible impacts and values that are not commercialized. They don't have a market value, and that's why research is typically funded by governments, research councils, philanthropy, and so on, because we can't identify the value, we can't identify the private benefits. So it is really important to try and find out what the social value is, because by monetizing it and finding out what it is, we can perhaps identify opportunities for commercialization. It doesn't mean that researchers want to commercialize their research. Sometimes, even though there's potential for commercialization, they don't want to do it for other reasons. But we should at least find out what the potential is for this commercialization. And I think finding out what the value is and what the beneficiaries are, what the potential for establishing a market where it didn't previously exist is important. This has been done in the environment. You know, in the last few years, multi-million-dollar markets in ecosystem services have been created, and they didn't exist previously. People were able to identify a demand and a supply for a particular service. They were able to value it, and a market was created. Payments for ecosystem services, biodiversity offsets, carbon values. There are multiple examples of creation of markets, of commercialization of values in the environment. So I'll finish with a call for research on the impact and social value of research. Again, a mouthful, but I think we really need more research in this area. So we know a lot about social values, we know a lot about impact, but we haven't really applied it to this area because it's very complex to do. There are many actors, many pathways to impact, etc. There are a few people that attempted this. They're in medical research, food safety research, e-research, there's some examples of this. But there's many disparate approaches. Many of them don't look at causal links between research and impact, and very few do subsequent valuation. Some suggestions would be to look at the Research Excellence Framework impact case studies, and someone should really do a meta-analysis of it and find out if we can actually have an idea of what the impact has been overall, and to try and value that impact, and also do an ex post evaluation of research grants. What has been the impact of a particular grant? What are the metrics? What are the values? This kind of impact evaluation could add to our knowledge of what these research grants, what the impact is. So why measure social value? Well, we can justify public subsidy for research and attract donors, but ultimately we can also highlight commercialization opportunities if we know what the value is and who the beneficiaries are. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Susanna, thank you so much. That's a fantastic overview of the importance of really, as you say, identifying those markets and identifying what some of those private benefits may be that could be commercializable for that public benefit. And Stefan, could I turn to you? So you're director of the Marshall Institute, which focuses on social enterprise and philanthropy at the LSE. And there's a very large movement and growing movement, isn't there, in social impact investing. So we're looking now from the other side. So who, when people are seeking to invest that money, either I suppose as philanthropists or as investors, what are they really looking for? Talk to us about, from that investor or philanthropist point of view, around social value and assessment of social value and what's important for them.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm even more delighted that I haven't yet disagreed with anything that's been said. And as Julia just introduced, I'm going to talk from the investor perspective and try to make a little bit of sense out of what capital, everything from philanthropy to investment capital, thinks it's talking about when it's talking about impact, which, as anyone who follows this field will know, they do all the time. Something in the order of $715 billion of investment capital in 2019, self-identified as impact capital. And the range of definitions of what impact means in that $715 billion capital pool is absolutely vast. And that spreads, of course, across into non-investment capital, the trillion-odd dollars of philanthropic capital in the US alone, a significant portion of which also identifies as impact capital. So I'm going to try and do three things in the brief time that we have this morning. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about what people think they mean when they talk about impact investing. I'm going to talk about what I think the challenges are for impact investing. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think the risks that we should avoid might look like when we think about capturing value from social science. Okay. So thing one, what is impact investing? It's investing that self-consciously has an intention to create positive social value. Okay. That might be absolutely synonymous with commercial value, or it might not. So if you imagine a spectrum from quasi-philanthropy through to market rate expectations, okay, that's what impact investing does. And some people will say you do that by negative screening. You choose not to invest in things which we know to cause harm. Let's imagine that's tobacco or fossil fuels. And some people think you invest not only not to do harm, but to do positive good. So you seek out opportunities that disrupt some kind of unjust equilibrium. Okay, so that is broadly speaking the spectrum. There is quite a big row going on about whether this is a real phenomenon or not, whether this is a rebranding of financial instruments in order to attract investors who are troubled by some of the negative externalities generated by our more conventional investing systems. And it's clear that it's not entirely clear what's going on yet. So, for example, investment portfolios that have included oil and gas have performed badly. Okay, that's not the same as an argument to say that negative screening improves market returns. Okay? It may be, but it isn't necessarily the same. The work that interests me most, that I spend most of my time thinking about, is not impact investing as not doing things. It's doing things. It's seeking out opportunities to address an unjust equilibrium somewhere in the world, a market or a state failure. In particular, that is crowding in quite a lot of new philanthropic capital. And quite clearly, a lot of that is going to depend on the kinds of things that we understand from social science. So as Ian was saying earlier on, quite a lot of what we're addressing at the moment presents as one kind of problem, but is in fact another kind of problem. COVID is a perfect example of this. That presents as a virological or a biological or an epidemiological challenge, but actually it's a social science challenge just as much. It's about the political responses, it's about the cultural responses, it's about regulatory change, it's about everything in our system. And in order for capital to support mechanisms to mitigate injustice, it's absolutely critical that they involve the social sciences. I think both Susanna and Ian have said that. So what are the challenges? I mean, apart from the fact that people don't yet understand what they mean by impact investing, what might the challenges be? Well, the first one is the one that Susanna has just been talking about. Well, you know, it's hard and it's complicated to understand attribution or causation when you're trying to produce a social value. Okay? But attribution in particular is really hard. It's a hard problem, as the supermarket and you know, if you read Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, and then you change something about your policy, making an attribution is hard. So what's social value? There's some progress being made in that. How will we know what will change as a result? All of these things complicate the impact environment, and they complicate the impact investing environment, and they require detailed thinking from across a whole range of disciplines, from economics to psychology to law to government to politics to sociology to philosophy, and indeed, as Ian reminds us, anthropology, although our colleague Conor Gearty always jokes that anthropology is the only discipline in which you get into trouble for having impact. And that is broadly true. So the last thing I want to talk about is what kind of impact success might we wish for, knowing what we know about the world to date. And I was struck in particular by the title of our session, Capturing Value. So the obvious model for how you invest in research-derived intellectual property is what happened in tech and venture capital in the US. That is everyone's favorite kind of go-to model. And what that essentially did was it extracted value, okay, from a system and put a fence around it. And that fence was to do with private capital. And I think that given the appetite in the investment community, given the appetite in philanthropy, given the ubiquity of this conversation about impact, we need to think really hard about creating an alternative model if we want to commercialize social science. We need to think about ways to translate value, or we need to think about ways to transform it or to share it, rather than simply to capture it. And one way to do that might be to say, every time there is an impact investment, okay, anything that describes itself as impact has to make a commitment to careful measurement, careful evaluation, careful experimentation, and careful reporting. Okay? And that might be seen as a tax on impact, but it might also be seen as a way of sharing the value that is being produced rather than capturing or privatizing it. So those are the three things I wanted to say. You know, what is it? Well, it's an attempt to combine investing or donating with an explicit public purpose that is in some way measurable and attributable. Why is it hard? Well, all the reasons that Ian and Susanna have already talked about. It's hard to know what value is. It's hard to make those attributions. It's very hard to measure, and it's hard to keep a grip on all the consequential or unintended consequences. And what might impact success look like from an investor perspective? Well, obviously, on the far right of the spectrum, it looks like market rate returns. But more interestingly, in the middle and on the left of that spectrum, it might look like an alternative model to that which we already understand, which you might call the capturing value model. Julia.
Excellent. Thank you, Stefan. That's incredibly helpful. And I think I'm not sure, I think it's probably reassuring that the impact investing community is grappling with exactly the same issues as the research community, actually, that this, and as you say, it is about public value and it is about how to share that value. But we know that measurement and assessment is not impossible, but oddly, on the one hand, so complicated because there are so many metrics that we could be using to which one to distill and boil down, that we get sort of confused. And I think there is also a danger as everybody moves into this, is what I call purpose washing. So everybody wants to demonstrate that they're doing some kind of social purpose and some kind of social value. So Nick, can we turn to you? Because I know at Middlesex you've been doing a lot of quite detailed work on just how we place value on things that we value. So why don't you take us through what you've been working on there?
Thanks very much, Julia, and I'll just try to share the screen. Sorry. Okay, is that working okay?
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Well, absolutely delighted to be here in this conversation and to be on this panel. And it's actually lovely going at the end of the panel because, as Stefan was saying, it's great to agree with everything that's gone before. What I'd like to do is give a university perspective, and it's not necessarily prescribing it for all universities at all, but at Middlesex, the real approach is that we are really focused on putting knowledge into action, and linking knowledge and action is really what we're all about. And that means that not everything that we do will have commercial value, but everything should have social value, and at least some of it, we will be looking for the commercial value in what we're doing. And going back to what Ian was saying, quite often there's a degree to which that is planned, but also there's a big degree to which that is emergent and needs to be recognized as we go along. And so the real focus, I think, is it is about measurement, as Susanna was saying, but it's also about understanding what we value, how we might evaluate it, and which parts of that we can measure and which parts of that we can't measure so straightforwardly. And so as we go through the processes from generating ideas to developing projects to then potentially having outcomes and impact, actually from a university perspective, we are doing different sorts of measurement. So at the initial stages, actually the first question really is, to what extent does this idea fit with our values? Is it something that is really going to push forward something we see as being important in the world? And we're also trying to make assessments of the amount of risk and focusing on cost and feasibility. As we then go into projects, again, as Susanna was saying, it's quite often much easier to measure your costs, although it's really important, I think, to put real focus on many of the intangibles, the unseens, the overheads, all of those sorts of areas that can be underrepresented in how we recognize things. And so there's quite a bit of additional support that often goes in there, often intangible. And then as we go forward from that, there are all the kind of, we referred to the Green Book earlier, which is absolutely right, but all the basics of business planning and social value planning. So what I'd like to do is just briefly describe one example that we've been working on now for about 10 years, and then just illustrate how some of those different ways of valuing might relate to it. And there are two written down, but I'm just going to choose one in the interest of time. And that's a project that was conducted in Kenya and was around fuel from waste, or ultimately became that. And the start off idea was around addressing urban economic dysfunction, economic exclusion and social problems in Kenya. And so there was quite a community orientation, a community work approach, and co-production, as Ian was saying, was built in right from the start. And there were various workshops done within the communities to look at how they might generate ideas that would have some both social and economic outcome. And one of the things that emerged from that process was a process of producing fuel briquettes, actually using domestic waste. Now, in the groups that they were working with, they'd traditionally been burning charcoal, and you'll be aware, obviously, that has a big impact environmentally. And so actually, ultimately, I think Julia's introduction, where we're looking at economic, social, and natural impact, all of those three are bound together in this. They used processes such as an unconference, in which there was a sharing of different sort of ideas, including academics who had social but also technical and economic backgrounds, along with people from the communities. And they also then went on to produce a next phase of the project, which looked at some market research and establishing networks for supply and distribution. And ultimately what happened was that a series of, in effect, micro businesses producing these fuel briquettes were created. And they then had not only changed their own reliance on charcoal, but they also produced small businesses that were starting to distribute and create economic value. But on top of that, a really important part was it really changed youth participation in the society and women's economic participation. And those two things actually became quite entwined and made a real difference. So in terms of a way of thinking about that, often when we're thinking about impact, as Susanna was saying, there's a kind of immediate sort of outcome. And so often you can make more direct causal claims in that. So in this sense, the immediate direct outcomes were producing value, in this sense, a set of techniques and actually intangible value in the sort of skills that were being developed, but also the assets of the equipment and the briquettes that were being produced. So there's both tangible and intangible. But a sort of meta level, there were different sorts of value being produced. So the broader social and economic impacts that I've just talked about, but also for the researchers, methodological and process impacts. So actually they developed their ideas of how they would have done this far better and done co-design and engagement far better than the first time they did it. So there are outcomes, I think, therefore, for learning in a variety of routes. And in terms of really placing value on what we value, again, like Susanna and Ian and Stefan, I wouldn't see this as being a simple linear process, but conceptually, I think it's quite helpful for us to think about the different phases through which we might go, which might move forwards and backwards, and there would be repeating cycles. But nonetheless, at the initial stage where we're trying to produce impactful research and engagement, then there are assets, both tangible and intangible, but also often the value is in the methods that are being produced that can be then developed and reproduced. At an enhancing stage, you're really building up the skills, both of the researchers and the academics, but also of the people in the community, and building up, in this case, business skills and production skills. But there's real value in the not only the know-how, but the know-who. And for these people who'd often been excluded from distribution networks, there was a question of how you build those networks in ways that would work. And then as you're trying to grow, there's all the usual challenges of measuring both economic and social outcome, as others have mentioned, but really paying attention to some of the emerging differences that are happening. And in our case, one of the things was to look at the gender distribution of the people involved in this, which hadn't been something that we'd started off on, but actually emerged partway through the process and was obviously adding a particular sort of value. And then on from that to expanding, where we're looking at particularly the issues of scaling up and scaling out connectivity and how you get sustainability within all of those settings. So that's a very quick whiz through, but what I'm trying to suggest is there are different types of value that occur at different periods and processes within the way we operate. And the measurement systems that we have, I think, need to both operate at all of these processes, and particularly operate in a way that allows us to make decisions. So for a university, which projects are we going to choose to back? For a funding body, which projects are they going to choose to back? How do we be sensitive to the emergent as well as the planned outcomes? And how can we then take advantage of at least some of them to recognize the commercial value of the immediate outcomes of the project, but also those broader scale outcomes? So I'll stop there, Julia. Thanks.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Nick. And thank you. I think breaking it down, although as we've heard, it's a complicated process, but recognizing those different impacts as we go through, and particularly those different levels, I think, of value in the setting, value in the context, and value in the process does enable us to get a bit of a purchase on what can otherwise just seem a problem which is so big it's difficult to know your way in. So I think you've given us some good kind of indications there of how to get a way into this problem. So we're going to open up for questions, and I'm going to ask people if they could put their questions in the Q&A. That's fine, though we can also be picking them up in the chat. But and we do have a couple of questions which have come in, which are circling around the issue of funding to start off with. So Beth Brockett, who's written to us in the chat, has said most of the most impactful social science research I've seen in the natural environment sector has been the results of good engagement, as Ian says, over many, many years, trust building, etc. And there's a question here, she asks, I'm concerned, should it not be about this kind of research being made to fit existing and economic financial models, but rather shouldn't those models be learning how best to support this kind of research? So it's around the kind of funding that we should be placing to be able to support this kind of research. And that links to another question which has come in, which asks, is the problem about social science research funding still too focused on academic publication? And Susanna's noted in the chat that actually there are rewards for impact there, but it's around that funding model to support the types of impacts that we're talking about, those long-term collective, difficult to value. So thoughts on that? Happy to throw that open. Nick, why don't I send that to you first as a VC? That's top of your, always top of the agenda. How do we get funding?
Yeah, no, my headline for that is completely agree. And actually, I think what we've all been doing today in the ideas and the examples is recognizing the sorts of things that really make a difference in the world. Now, I absolutely agree that it's going to be impossible to measure all of that. I think we just need to measure enough of it to be confident that we're heading in the right direction. And so when we're thinking about funding, one of the interesting questions would be around how we are supporting the sorts of collaborative work that we're thinking about. So for example, in the projects, do we allow for secondments that might not be the very traditional sort of apparently high expertise secondment in which a great academic goes and spends a little bit of time in industry, or an industrial leader comes back into academia for a while. But actually, can we think about ways of using that sort of principle of exchanging time and value that means that we can actually pay for people who are members of communities to be part of these projects, as opposed to assuming that they've got the economic well-being that just enables them to participate. Secondly, I think there's a lot that we can learn both from anthropology, but also from development studies. And that if we're really interested in being very inclusive about this, then actually we need to think about the costs in a slightly more broad way. So an example that I didn't give you was around the use of music and music technology for people with very, very limited language ability and communication ability. And it was, I mean, when you saw what was happening, it was utterly transformative. People using iPads and expressing themselves in a way through sound that they couldn't through normal spoken language. But obviously, when you're doing that, you need to make sure you're funding the carers, the space, the technology. And so I think we can think about funding in a more generic way in that sense. In terms of evaluation, I think we can then also deliberately measure processes of collaboration. So let's look at how many of those people were involved, what the outcomes were from their perspective. And there's all sorts of qualitative ways that we can make assessments, which is why I'm really keen that we think about both quality and measurement, and don't lose one or the other, which is one of, in my view, one of the central messages of social science anyway. So I think that helps us with funding, but it also helps universities say, but this is of value and this is what we want to be doing anyway, and it's part of our mission as organisations that are trying to enable dialogue.
Yeah.
Julia.
Stefan, did you want to get Ian? Yes.
Yeah, do you mind?
Go for it.
But both the questions from Beth and I think Christopher, I just completely agree with. So let me just reflect a little bit, if I just may.
Yeah.
It's absolutely clear to me that we shouldn't be in a, if you like, very, very traditional, if you like, economic modelling sense. And I feel nervous about saying that, chaired by a leader of London School of Economics, where I spent 4 wonderful years. But I do think we need to think much more imaginatively about the funding, and much more imaginatively about, in social value, what does success look like?
Yeah.
And I've always found it, a very, very, important part of any project to sit down with the potential beneficiaries and say, what would good look like?
Yeah.
And you never quite know where that's going to go, but you actually start then to think about how you can do research, which at the end of the day is going to have some social value. That's my first point. So really sitting down with potential beneficiaries and asking really quite difficult questions around what does success look like. And something Beth said that I completely agree with. That doesn't come from just pitching up in 2 seconds. You have to build trust, and that's an important part. Second point, which is just also linked to something Nick said, you've got to be a bit more flexible sometimes about funding. My former colleague Zoe Matthews, who is just a brilliant social scientist, did a lot of work with traveling people. And I remember one piece of work in the 1980s she did on health. The only way this work was going to happen was they funded the traveling people themselves in order to work on their own communities. Quite important. And another anecdote, finally, very quickly, I was going to work with Abu Bakr Bahaj, and the work we wanted to do was to see the impact of putting solar panels into villages in northern Yemen to get electricity for the very first time. Really good. And the funding agency said, oh, no. The solar panels would be aid, not research. And it was just like, I'm sorry, that's not the way forward, So I think we need to know what success looks like, and we need to be much more flexible in the funding about how we get there. And that's, to me, very important. And I think those 2 questions enunciate that beautifully. Thank you.
Brilliant. Stefan, from your perspective.
Yeah, what I've just heard from Nick and Ian, but also Beth's question has made me has made me wonder whether what we also need to think about is a more honest kind of conversation as between the research and the funding. Because we are, I think, and this may be a rather unpopular thing to say, I think we are locked in an impact dance that is not always an honest dance. So we do the research we think we want to do anyway, and then tell people what its impact might be. And we fund research that makes us look good and tell people in advance what its impact should be. Okay, I mean, obviously I exaggerate and caricature, but that's not really a very honest dance. And one of the ways to read what's been said this morning is that people are saying, this is more complicated, less linear, takes longer, and is less predictable, and is less categorizable in our conventional kind of instruments than we would all like to think. So one of the ways for the impact conversation to make progress, I think, is a serious dose of humility on the research side and the funding side, particularly on the funding side. I raise that as a possibly unpopular proposition.
Always have to be controversial. I think I think that's incredibly rich set of answers there. Also conscious of a lot of questions coming in, and one of them is around metrics, as you would expect. And so quite a specific question, Nick, for you, but we can use it as a platform to spring out from Wendy Twist, asking about some of the metrics that we use to measure value across the levels that you described. And linking to that is from somebody anonymous about how important and informative the REF impact case studies in comparison with social impact metrics. So just thinking a little bit more precisely around metrics. And if I could add to that the issue of scale, because I know from some, it's about the question of scale. You know, if it's got good scale, then that demonstrates high impact. But I think often what we're talking about are quite sort of point interventions, and so they seem to be quite ad hoc and quite limited, as opposed to here's my drug course, you know, to cure cancer, etc. So how can we get some sort of traction on this very difficult issue of metrics? Susanna, I'm going to go to you first on that one, and then while the rest of you think about it, Nick, think about it.
Well, I was going to answer the question on the REF impact case studies.
Yeah.
I think it was a really good development that universities were asked to also look at the impact of their research. So not just the research environment, the publications and things like that, but what has been the impact of that research? That's been a fantastic development, and it now has a substantial weight in how universities are assessed. The problem is that there's not enough resources and time to produce these impact case studies, because as all the panelists talk about this, it's extremely difficult to measure the impact and the value of your research, and having to do that without very little resources is extremely hard. And being involved in putting these case studies together, it's very difficult. You have to contact policymakers and find out, I mean, how did my book have an impact in what you did, and was it mentioned in your policy documents? And it's very difficult to go beyond that. What actually changed? How did it affect well-being in society? It's extremely difficult. It's really important to do, and it's the right thing to do, but this is a kind of a separate research project, and asking researchers to do that as part of the research excellence framework always falls short of the real impact of the research, because in itself it would be we need to do ex post impact evaluation of the research to find out what the impact is, and that in itself is a research project. So I think it's a real way forward, and I would like to actually someone to do an analysis of all these impact case studies, find out what the metrics are that's being used, what is the shortfall in terms of measuring real well-being impacts, and what do we need what kind of work do we need to reach a true measure of the impact of the research at universities, which is huge, but it's just difficult to measure.
So
Julia,
Nick, yes, no, Ian and then Nick, yeah.
Yeah, just look, I absolutely agree with everything Susanna has just said, everything. But I just wanted to
Peace and conflict, guys.
Oh, no. But I just wanted to add something. You know, I do think it is incumbent on universities not just to wait for the impact case studies to appear, but to be relaxed and to build into the opportunity of promotion the fact that people are trying to do this, because it can take a lot of time, you know, and let's not pretend that you write your great piece of research and then somehow it becomes policy. You end up spending a lot of time with communities, with building things forward. And I do think that universities need to recognize that, because otherwise people will say, well, actually, I won't do it. I'll write the next academic paper. Now, I know many universities do that now, so I'm not, you know, please saying this the whole time, but I do think it is incredibly important that we recognize not only the difficulty of measuring the evaluation, I mean, I've written loads of letters in the last couple of months about people who've done things that have impacted on the pandemic for the ref, but the time it takes to really have an impact, I think is really important. That is recognized as a good thing to do in your career in higher education. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick.
Thanks, and thanks for the question. I think it also relates to Beth's point, the idea that Ian has just been raising, that in reality, these things, I mean, certainly the project I was talking about has now been going for over a decade, and it just does not happen without all sorts of personal investment, university investment, financial, non-financial, all of that stuff absolutely has to go on, and I think we need ways of recognizing it. I think Ian's point actually about making sure we recognize that in academic careers, because for sure a lot of measurement and evaluation goes on there that can really drive one sort of behavior as opposed to another. I think we probably need a bit of a revolution on that. The question was around the different kind of phases of work that I was talking about. And I wouldn't claim that we've got this cracked by any means, but I hope we're starting to define a question that would be helpful. So I think there are elements of that which are measurable in financial terms in the way that Susanna was talking about. So you can actually measure the cost of the equipment that was developed. You can measure the economic benefit from the briquettes and the sale of the briquettes and so on. And you can also look at that scaling up across time. So those sorts of things, I think you can put a monetary value on. What is much harder to do, and actually this is another project going on at the moment, is really to understand how social value entwines with that. So for example, the networks of distribution also involve quite a lot of trust, but also status and hierarchy and relationships and all sorts of negotiation. And so those things are actually really quite hard to evaluate. The second thing that I think is hard to evaluate is really the co-production part of this and how people have experienced change. And to do that, I think there are social measures that you can use, looking at attitudes and understandings at the early part, during and at the end of it. And so I think you need a combination of those things, and we've got some of that, but not all of it. The other thing that I would just put a little bit of emphasis on, and this is the flexibility word that Ian used, and actually the honesty word that Stefan used, is that actually some of these things changed during the time, and it wasn't, you know, we didn't have a lovely plan, delivered it, and it all came out fine. Actually, stuff went right and wrong during the time. There are all sorts of unexpected costs. There are all sorts of unexpected outcomes. So I think there is also a need to have, in addition to Beth's point about this is a long build-up, it's also that we need to have a way of recognizing value where it occurs and accepting that we will have very imperfect measures of that because we didn't do it before, during, and after, because we didn't know about it at the before stage. But I think nonetheless, if you can try and get the social measures with attitudes amongst co-participants, economic value where you're actually looking for it, and then some level of market assessment, and I think you can do those latter two in at least some degree of monetization. Really helpful.
So more questions than we can get to grips with, I'm sure, but I'm going to pick up one from Mark Mann here because I'm looking for something to sort of provoke us a little bit. So quoting Harry Truman, "It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. Should we not start worrying about the attribution of value and just get on with creating it?" What do the panel think on that? Ian, I can see you poised.
I was going to say that I have enormous sympathy with that statement, However, I actually think there is also something in being able to celebrate success. So I'm 100% about let's just get on with it. But in just getting on with it, we need to, as I said earlier, we need to know what success looks like. So what are we getting on with? And we need to then be in a position to celebrate that success, because that will have, it seems to me, a virtuous circle of, if you're celebrating success, people will think, gosh, I can do that. Because so often people think, I can't do it. Can I really, as an individual, have an impact? Well, yes, you can, but you need to believe it. And, so I think we should just get on with it 100%. That's certainly what I always have done. But at the same time, we need to be able to identify what it is that we're getting on with, so that we can measure what success looks like. And it doesn't have to always be quantitative measurement, let me be clear, and that we can then celebrate it.
I think we should probably also distinguish between credit and causation. I mean, when I talk about attribution, I'm not talking about credit, I'm talking about causation. So I'm thinking about it as a narrowly technical expression, rather than it was this department or this scholar or this team or this university.
I mean, I would also add to this that just getting on with creating it, it's a nice idea, but ultimately we live in a world with scarce resources. And so we need to understand which types of research are more impactful, because we can't fund everything. And so ultimately there needs to be some evaluation of the types of things that we're creating, because unfortunately we can't just fund everything. So from a practical perspective, I think it is important to try and evaluate what we're doing.
Julia, can I just add something to that?
Yes, and then Nick. Yeah,
very,
go for it.
it's something that I absolutely have been wanting to say for a while. I completely agree that we ought to do exactly as Suzanne just said, but it's incredibly important, if you do that, that you know what, if you like, the selectivity is. So if, for example, you've got a program which pays by results on reoffending, then what you end up is that the program goes and finds the easy people, doesn't get reoffended, and you miss the most disadvantaged members of society. So some of the most challenging areas of work will have relatively low, in terms of numbers, payback, but perhaps relatively high in terms of the impact on those people. And it's the same as school league tables. You need to know what the characteristics are of the pupils in the classroom before you start to say, well, let's just measure what the exam results are at the end. It's just really, really important that we do not get into a position where the most disadvantaged members of society are left out, because that's the hardest to work with. Thank you.
Excellent.
The thing I'd like to just add, Julia, is to think a little bit about the distinction and the connection between ownership and contribution. Mm-hmm. And I think certainly within universities, there's a long tradition of us thinking about ownership. So people build careers by leading a thing that is their area, and that's how they build the CV, and that's how they get promoted, or they are the PI, and so on. And actually everything we've been talking about today says, if anything, that's part of the story and it's not the whole story. And actually there's lots of other elements of influence going on. And I think we can shift that balance towards saying, actually, our question is, what have people contributed? And that means that we need to make sure that the rewards relate to contribution and the way that people have enabled, rather than how have they circumscribed or protected their own area. And so I think we can write that into the way that we have academic careers. We can write that into the way that we think about funding models. But also, coming back to some of the other points that have been mentioned, I think we also need to think about intrinsic reward. And for many of the projects that we've discussed today, making sure that the people in the communities are genuinely co-leading, co-designing, and also get the right rewards from that. So I would really focus on contribution rather than ownership. And I think that's one of the things in universities we could do. And
I think particularly there was a question in from Jonathan Breck, which is on my favourite hobby horse, but unfortunately we don't have time to go into it, which is around IP. And obviously IP is a legal construction, and that legal construction does not help protect ideas of social science ideas. So you cannot ward off your competitors for 20 years whilst you poodle around with something you've got a patent for. it is much, much harder. So IP just does not count in social sciences, and that's a feature of the way the law is constructed. It's not a feature of the nature of research itself. So I just thought I'd get that in there because that is a little. We have so many questions, and I think we could have at least 3 more sessions actually in order to get through this, but we are up against time this morning. Thank you so much to everybody who's been participating. We've had a fantastic level of participation. Thank you so much for all of your questions. I'm sorry we haven't been able to take all of them, but that's because they were so good. So each one of them needed quite a lot of engagement because they were so probing in themselves. So thank you so much for that. And thank you finally to the panel. Thank you to Ian and to Susanna and to Stefan and to Nick. Fantastic insights today. Thank you so much for taking the time and sharing them with us. And I think we'll just have to say, see you next time. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.